Guten Morgen, Jenny hier. Ihr schaut den Einmischen-Podcast, hier wird Politik betreut. Und wenn ihr die heutige Folge unterstützen wollt, liked, teilt und abonniert diesen YouTube-Kanal. Andere Möglichkeiten findet ihr in den Shownotes, Steady, PayPal, Überweisung oder meine allseits beliebte Wunschliste gefüllt mit Büchern und Dingen, die wirklich Spaß machen. Und in diesem Sinne entlasse ich euch in die heutige Folge. Habt viel Spaß, gebt mir Feedback, kommentiert. Ich würde mich sehr freuen. Bis bald. Good morning, dear listeners, and maybe those who are watching this video. Today, my guest is someone who has spent the last 15 years reporting from the heart of Europe. Dave Keating is an American European journalist based in Brussels, where he serves as Brussels correspondent for France 24. He has also written for the New Statesman, Forbes, Euroactiv, and World Politics Review, and previously served as editor of EuropeanVoice.com, a publication of the Economics Group. He is a former senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of the popular Substack newsletter Gulf Stream Blues, ranked as the #1 EU social media influencer in 2023. Dave has a rare ability to make the complex machinery of European politics accessible to audiences around the world. Before settling in Brussels in 2010, he reported from London, Washington, Paris, Prague, Chicago, and New York. His new book, The Owned Continent, published in December 2025, makes a bold, provocative argument that Europe has become psychologically dependent on the United States and that it will take far more than policy changes to break free. Welcome, Dave. I am happy to have you here.
Happy to be here.
And I will start with something that came up to me while reading your book and trying to translate a little bit in German, because in English it's called The Owned Continent. In German it would be called Der besessene Kontinent, which translates to possessed in German and obsessed. And I think both in German would be great translations.
That's very good to know because, in fact, I'm working with my French publisher right now on the French edition of the book, which is coming out on the 7th of May. And we're talking about how to translate the title. And in French, le continent possessé has a double meaning with like possessed by a devil or a ghost, which possessed also has in English. But of course, we also then have the word owned. So then you avoid that. So we decided not to go with that. We're probably going with something else. Maybe I shouldn't say yet. But good to know. I love that the German word has this double meaning because that is exactly what I'm going for. And that's a bit the struggle with the French title at the moment, is that I want something that encapsulates all three areas of ownership that I talk about in the book, which is cultural, military, and economic. And so, yeah, obsessed completely summarizes the European cultural dominance of the United States.
Yeah, but possessed in German would be besessen, can also be translated to be possessed by a demon in some way.
Okay, interesting. In all three languages, that's interesting. Well, I'm currently on the search for a German publisher to do a German edition of the book. So when I find one, hopefully, I'm going to suggest this word as the title.
Yeah, please take Der besessene Kontinent, because it's such a double meaning. Because it's I'm hardly able to translate it into English because it's such a great German word, besessen. So you are obsessed and possessed by something at the same time.
Totally sums up what I'm conveying in the
Yes. The German language is such a great thing.
Yes. I did try learning it once upon a time. I only had limited success.
Maybe you can try with starting with besessen.
Yes, exactly.
So before we get into your book, tell me something. How how did you make your own way to Brussels and to the European Union, and what did you find there?
Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of people, maybe even most people here in the EU capital, find themselves here kind of by accident. Usually, the expat story in Brussels is that they usually came for a job. That's usually the reason you come to Brussels if you're an expat. And then either they kind of accepted living here even though they don't like it, or they came to love it. In my case, it's the latter. I came to love it. Took a while for me to love it, as I outlined in the book, but I got there in the end. But actually, my story of coming here is different than most people's because I came here very intentionally. Short version of the story is my last job in the U.S. was covering the U.S. Congress in Washington for an NPR affiliate. And I was very disillusioned with U.S. politics. It was the time of the Iraq War. I was disillusioned by that. I was disillusioned by the nationalism and jingoism that had come to dominate American life following the 9/11 attacks. And I was disillusioned by how broken US governance was and still is. That the US is the oldest democracy in the world, that it's operating under a constitution that is meant for 230 years ago, not meant for the modern world. And I could see it in the halls of Congress, how things just didn't work, but nobody talked about it because we're really raised in the United States to believe that the Constitution was chiseled on tablets and handed to us from Moses, practically. And so I really just saw no good outcome for the United States. It seemed to be going in a very bad direction. And I felt kind of no hope for the US. It seemed like only a negative trajectory. And then I picked up a book called The European Dream by Jeremy Rifkin, which it was kind of by accident that I stumbled upon the book. It was a book for Americans about the European Union and how Americans were unaware that this emerging superpower was coming on the stage, that Europe was federating, and that it was going to really challenge the United States. I read a similar book called The United States of Europe by T.R. Reid, and those two books really excited me about the possibilities of Europe. And at a time when I needed excitement, I needed something to believe in, I needed hope. And so I thought, I was a journalist and also I was a European history major and undergraduate in university. And so I thought, what a great way to put those two things together. It was interesting, actually, that the European Union is not really part of an American history course. For Americans, European history ended in 1989. So I didn't really know what the European Union was, despite having done a year abroad in Prague. At that time, Czech Republic wasn't yet in the EU. So I was only kind of vaguely aware of it. I think I had the same impression as a lot of Americans still do today, that the EU is just United Nations for Europe or something, not that it's actually a confederation that makes laws. So I found the easiest way to get to Europe, which was to go to London with a reporting job covering private equity investment. That's kind of the easiest way that an American can get a work visa. And then, as I outlined in the prologue of the book, I eventually made my journey to Brussels happen. Lots of twists and turns in that story. And that story brought me to a couple different European capitals in the meantime. But eventually I made it here and was able to build a career covering the European Union. So it was nice. I kind of manifested that for myself, an idea I had one day sitting in Washington back in 2005. And eventually I ended up exactly where I wanted to end up.
Oh, so many things right now. Maybe I start with this thing you mentioned, that America is the oldest democracy in the world. In fact, it will
controversial polemic statement, I know, but
it will.
back it
Yeah.
up.
I'm not going to start a war with my Greek friends.
Yes, it's always the Greeks
yes.
are usually objective.
Yes, please, no.
But
no
I have
hate
my
on us
counter
here.
arguments ready.
I'm just saying it out of the thinking of an American, the oldest democracy in the world. The country is 250 years old. In this year, it will be celebrating its birthday, more or less. The British may remember this too. And the thing is, you just said it's a little bit rusty by now, the democracy as well.
Archaic, I would say.
Yeah, I'm using a nicer word. But at the same time, I have this thought that Americans and America look down to Europe as this old continent that's even more rustic, even more decayed. We had Marco Rubio in Munich just a few days ago talking about the fight for Western civilization and that it's decaying in Europe, as I would say is a slap in the face for every European in Europe, because we define what Western civilization is, not Marco Rubio, who's in fact the child of migrants from Cuba. Yeah, I'm not racist in any way, but he is such a in Germany we would say Heuchler. Yeah, he's double-faced, and I would like to understand how Americans look on Europe, especially now, as the continent is trying to survive, as it tries to make the European Union function better. But at the same time, it's fighting this fight against America as well, who's trying to control it, to vassalize it. And in the end, America looks down on Europe.
Yes, completely. It's interesting. My opinion, that's not an opinion, my diagnosis of the fact that America is the oldest democracy in the world isn't a common one amongst Americans. Americans also subscribe to this idea that America is the new world, the young, dynamic child, maybe like teenager, and Europe is the old world. Europe is old-fashioned and slow and full of ancient wisdom, but unable to act, kind of like an old man. And actually, that's the riff of the title of the book. The Owned Continent is supposed to be a play on the old continent. But I don't think this is an old continent at this point. In fact, that's why I came here, because the young democracies of Europe are much more capable of adjusting to modern realities than the old democracy of the United States. So you could make the argument that European civilization or European nations are older than the United States. You cannot say that European states are older than the United States, because they're simply not. There's only 3 countries in Europe that could claim to be older than the United States in terms of a state, and that is Sweden, Denmark, and the United Kingdom. Every other European country is either a modern invention within the past 200 years, that applies to most European countries, or...
For example, Germany is younger than America, United States.
Younger. Yeah. Almost a century younger. And so you have like 2 categories of European countries: one, modern inventions, or you have old monarchies that were converted into nation states, such as Spain, Portugal, France. But those countries, the nation state is a modern invention, right? So the degree of continuity between the Kingdom of France and the modern Republic of France is very tenuous. And that's even true for the constitutional monarchies of Sweden and Denmark, which kept their system of governance in name, but in fact fundamentally transformed. All of that is to say that in 2005, when I looked to Europe, I didn't look at it as, I love European history, so I'm going to a giant museum to appreciate the history. No, I was going to a continent that was ready for the modern world, I thought at the time. And that applies to, of course, the European Union, which is a project. That's why we call it the European project. It is a government in the making. It is a confederation now, but it may be converted into a full federation of some form, but also the individual national governments of Europe. I mean, I was amazed to see that European countries could update their constitutions. I know it seems like something totally normal to Europeans. The United States hasn't updated its constitution for almost 100 years. And right now, it would be impossible to conceive of such a thing. There is no way you could get 2/3 approval among the states and in the Congress for a change in the Constitution, the way the partisan divide is and will remain as long as we have this current iteration of civilian government. There's no way the U.S. could change its Constitution. And also, no one even talks about doing so because, like I said, we're taught that the Constitution is the sacred thing that we can't touch. So I've been really amazed by Europe's ability to adapt, which is an ability that my home country doesn't have. And therefore, this narrative that Europe is the old continent and America is the young one, it's just not accurate anymore. It's, in my view, it's really the opposite of that.
Yeah, I always try to understand what Americans see when they see Europe. And there's this joke on TikTok where Americans say they are visiting the country of Europe. And sometimes I think they are just saying it to trigger every fucking European that's on the platform. And they all come out of the woodworks. This is not a country. We have so many different countries. Europe is a continent. And so on and so on. And at the same time...
I think also I would just point out quickly that, you mentioned how Marco Rubio's speech and saying that, basically the United States doesn't want a modern Europe. For these people, Europe is something of 100 years ago, like what it was when their ancestors got on boats and came over. And they want Europe to stay like that. And that's why these MAGA people get so enraged when they come to Europe and they see, shock horror, non-white people walking around the streets of European capitals. It really offends them because in their minds, Europe should stay exactly what it was when their ancestors left. They don't care about the European Union. They don't care about everything that's happened in Europe. Americans really have very stereotypical ideas of Europe that are from decades, if not centuries ago. You still have this idea that Germany they're warmongers and France are cheese-eating surrender monkeys and the British are stiff upper lip, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's just these tired stereotypes, but it actually affects policy. And, stereotypes don't come from nowhere. I think every stereotype has a ring of truth. But actually, these are different than stereotypes. They're like frozen in time impression from long ago. And it's partly because, as I said, the way we learn European history, to the extent that people learn it at all, is based on things from decades ago at the most recent, even when you specifically study European history in university. So I think that's where this is coming from Rubio and MAGA. They want Europe to be something frozen in time from a century ago, and it offends them when they see a Europe that is modern.
Yeah, this is so interesting because the fact that France got overrun by Nazi Germany in the 20th century, that was in fact not normal. France
it was an anomaly.
Such a military powerhouse for most of the European history, and it affected France for the decades to come. It affected how they went on to go against their colonies and when they tried to break free because they could not comprehend to give up again. So this has long lasting consequences for European history after the fact. And
it's
the
like
French
the Americans.
The French are not known for being wussies in the military sense.
The Americans are basing their impressions on Europe on a 5-year period. But when you look at the entire century, especially the past 80 years, you see an extremely militaristic France and an extremely pacifist Germany. It's the exact opposite of the trope that Americans have. And so right now, as Germany is rearming and talking about its own nuclear umbrella, I mean, I just see these tired takes from Americans being like, oh, Germany is rearming, we should all be scared. It's as if you went to sleep 80 years ago and just woke up now in 2026. It's so stupid, but it's something I've heard all my life from Americans when they're talking about Europe.
Yeah, for me as European, all those changes are worrying because I know my history well. I know the history of the countries that surround us. And the future is unknown. And that's why in Germany this is such a great controversial inside the society. What's happening here? We have such a great problem with the inequality in our society between the young and the old, and all those changes will have consequences for the politics. I'm pretty sure Merz and his CDU, CSU, and SPD coalition, they will not hold the next years, because the changes that are necessary in our culture, in our society, and in our politics, those parties are not equipped for those changes. They are stuck in the past. And the thing is, you told me the American political system cannot really change because the society is not able to change right now, I think. But there's a difference here in Europe, because if there is crisis, we need to change. And we try to make our politicians change as well. And there will be a point when the people make them change and make them change the politics. Because what we have learned the last 100 years is we try to make those changes gradually, slowly, because crisis is always ends up in war. And Europe does not do good in war. Everyone suffers. That's what we learned. That's why the institutions we have are so slow. That's maybe why the Americans think this is an old continent and it's so rusty and but slowly is mostly good. Yeah, slow changes are mostly good. And at the same time, as you talked about how Americans see this old continent and they want to have a white Europe that does not change, we, looking back at that history, remember that the phases when Europeans left for America were great phases of great crisis and wars. Yeah, because when all those Irish left Ireland, they were starving in the essence. And when Germans left Germany for America, those young Germans did not have jobs in Germany. That was a big crisis in Germany. That was, in fact, it was the starting point for Germany to change to this export nation, this industrialized nation. Every time we lose people, that's the time we know it's a big crisis. And interestingly, America is losing people now towards Europe. And that's
there's been some
too.
articles about that recently. Yeah. I mean, I personally am taking those articles with a bit of a grain of salt because it doesn't really match what I'm experiencing and hearing anecdotally. But I think it is true that people are talking about it in a way that they haven't yet. The United States has no history of emigration. That's why when I made the decision to emigrate, people were so confused by it, both in America and in Europe. You know, when I left in January 1st, 2007, he said I was leaving for good. I was like, I am emigrating. I am choosing to move my life to Europe. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to go flit around in Europe for a while. See you in a couple of years. No, I made it very clear that if I ever returned to the United States, I would be feeling like I had failed in my endeavor. Americans just put their minds. But it also, when I arrived in London and I told people, you know, I think I write about this in the book. It drove me crazy that, you know, I'm from the New York City area and I immediately moved from New York City, and British people kept responding, well, why would you come here to London? Ugh. Like, London is a much better city than New York, in my opinion. And so I thought it was crazy that people kept saying that people were just confused why I would leave the United States, this paradise that they dream of going to move to. And I know I get a lot of pushback when I say this from Europeans, especially on like Blue Sky or places like that. People are like, what are you talking about? Europeans hate America. They would never want to move there. Sorry, that is not my experience. And maybe people don't tell you their opinions about America because you are European. But as an American, for 20 years, the vast, vast majority of Europeans I talk to say some line of they wanted to move to America or they still want to move to America. Like, that is a real thing. I mean, I know of what I speak because people tell me, I don't know, you know, sometimes I think people are maybe just trying to flatter me. Like, they think you meet someone from country X and you're supposed to say something nice about country X. But You know what I can tell? I'm Belgian now, and when I travel, I sure as hell don't tell people I'm American. When people ask me where I'm from, I say I'm from Belgium, which is true. I'm a Belgian citizen and I live in Belgium. I've literally come from Belgium. But I mostly do it because it is a conversation ender. Nobody has anything to say about Belgium, and so we don't have to engage in some stupid small talk. My partner is Italian, and I'm actually Italian. That's my other passport, Italy. But I've never in my life said I am Italian or from Italy because I'm not. But that one is from ancestry. But when you say I'm from Italy, everybody has something to say about that. Usually something positive, but especially for the U.S. When I travel, the response would either be, "Oh, I love America. It's so amazing. I went to city X and I was so great." That's the usual response. But I also get America. I hate America. And then it's like, I just want to buy a bagel. Like, I don't want to have this conversation. So I I say Belgium because it's a conversation ender. But that is all just to say that it's not just that people, because sometimes Europeans say, "Oh, but their people are just trying to be nice about your country when you say you're from their place." And when they talk to me, a European, they say to me, they're being more honest. But no one has ever complimented Belgium when I say I'm from Belgium. I have never heard anyone say, "Belgium, what a beautiful place. I dream of living there." No one has ever said that. So it's not that. So it's this pull that America still has over Europeans' lives.
As a German, I have to say, "Oh, Belgium, the place we are driving through on our way to Paris."
Yes.
No, coming back to your book, we had a few days ago, I think now just 2-3 days ago, this Supreme Court decision on tariffs and the power of the American president. At the same time, the European-American trade deal has been come in question. Ursula von der Leyen said a deal is a deal, and her surrender deal has to come through. But at the same time, the parliament has said, nah, we don't really want this deal. I remember back when she made this surrender deal, which is a great description, by the way, I took from you. My question was, why? Oh God, why does she surrender to this bumbling idiot? Maybe you can explain why she did it and how it ended up influencing you to write this book.
Yeah, I talked about this at the book launch for the book last month, that actually her sitting down at that golf course next to Trump looking like his hostage and signing that deal, it made me so angry that I started writing the book the next day. The idea for the book actually came from a Substack back in May of last year about America's cultural dominance over Europe, and people's real surprise. My readers on Substack were saying, "Wow, I never thought about this before. You're right." And this would be a good topic for a book. But it's one thing to have an idea to write a book. It's another thing to actually sit down and write it. It was von der Leyen's surrender that got me to sit down and started writing it, because I had to do something. It was so outrageous what happened. I mean, Europe had so many tools to hit back against Trump's tariff extortion, and they didn't. And it's not that they had no choice. You saw that Brazil, India, and China hit back, and they ended up winning. Trump backed off. The lesson of last year was clearly that if you surrender to Trump, he comes back for more. If he senses weakness, he's going to pay his attention to the weak one, not to the strong one. He ignores the strong ones. So that moment was very disappointing to me. That being said, we could see it coming, because what happened was in May of last year, so after the announcement of the Liberation Day tariffs, first, Emmanuel Macron and France was driving the initial impulse for response. That was to freeze this list of retaliatory tariffs that had already been drawn up during Trump's first term, just as a first step. Then it was to threaten a much more robust tariff response that would match, I think the threat was 20%, so it would match the 20% from the European side. Then there was the idea to use the anti-coercion instrument. Now, this is an instrument that was invented only a couple years ago, and it was intended for use against China. Macron said, no, okay, we thought that it was going to be China threatening us. Now it's America. So we need to be agnostic about who's doing the threatening. So we need to at least threaten to use this anti-coercion instrument. That's sometimes called the nuclear option. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration of its effect, but it's true that you would really using it would risk mutually assured economic destruction. But the point is, you wield it kind of like a nuclear weapon, that Trump would never dare to pull the trigger on doing something equal to the EU, because the EU can also destroy America's economy. There was a good study about this recently. I don't have the study in front of me, but the Morning Post Substack wrote about it yesterday, which was looking at all the tools Europe has, the vulnerabilities that America has, that Europe has leverage over. Because we talk so much about the vulnerabilities of Europe that America has leverage over, we never talk about how the things that exist in the other direction. So you can see why European citizens would have the impression that we have no leverage, but we do have leverage. The issue is we didn't use it, and we're still not even thinking about using it. And what happened was Macron was kind of in the driver's seat there, but he is in so much political trouble now because of his very ill-advised decision to call a snap election in 2024. That he, his keeps losing control of parliament. It's a real domestic political disaster there. And so he's really lost political capital on the European stage here in Brussels. He's becoming more and more irrelevant. Chancellor Merz was just elected. He's just come into office. He has the wind at his back for the moment, although I agree with your assessment that he's not going anywhere. But in June of last year, he was kind of the strongest leader, but I use that, that's damning with faint praise, because we have a leadership vacuum in Europe, and he because he had just come into office, and only because of that, he came into the June European Council summit as the kind of strongest one, and he cajoled the council into going his way, which was the surrender way. And again, we could talk about how inaccurate the American stereotypes are of Germany and France here. France was the one that wanted to go to war, to trade war on this, and Germany was the one that wanted to immediately surrender. And the other countries coalesced around Germany. Obviously, Giorgia Meloni prefers a surrender to Donald Trump, but also Poland pretty quickly gave in. Donald Tusk gave into the Merz line of thinking. Merz has strong backers in Mitsotakis and Greece and all of his EPP brethren in the council, which is still the largest party in the council, and has dominated EU politics for 20 years, which is crazy. We can talk more about that maybe. But so that's what happened. In June, at the June European Council Summit, the leaders decided to surrender. But, they didn't come out and announce that, right? The leaders didn't come out to their post-council press conferences waving big white flags saying, Donald Trump, we surrender. And so I think the media didn't really pick up on what had happened. I was hoping beyond hope that von der Leyen might push back. I knew that she wouldn't. It's not in her character. Wrote a Substack I think on the day of Trump's inauguration, I wrote on Substack that von der Leyen will not lead the resistance against Trump. It's just not who she is. She is, number one, an Atlanticist, and she still is, and she just does not have the mental capacity to not be an Atlanticist. She is too old to change her view at this point, right? I mean, that's not to say old people can't change their views. I'm pretty old now. I can change my views, but it's just not in her nature. She's really set in her way. I hoped maybe, just maybe, because if we had a strong commission president, if we had a Jacques Delors in that office right now, they would have pushed back against this council impulse for surrender. But she chose to execute exactly what Friedrich Merz and the other council leaders told her to do, which was a surrender, because she's not strong, because she does exactly what the European Council told her to do. I wrote about this in a profile I did of her a Berlin-based publication called IP Quarterly, where I wrote that she is a servant in the council and a tyrant in the commission. She's basically consolidated power within the institution that she leads, the commission, sidelining all of the other commissioners. when she steps across the streets to the European Council, she's a servant. She never pushes back on the council, and she does whatever they say. In this case, whatever they said was to surrender to Donald Trump. And so she dutifully flew to Scotland, waited for him to finish golfing. Like they were just like in a side run, just patiently waiting for him to finish golfing. And he comes out and he humiliates her. And she even repeats his line about the EU being unfair to Trump. Like she's repeating his lies. He said it, like as if she was a dummy and he was her ventriloquist. So that's why that happened. Now, let's flash forward to right now. The Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, struck down the tariffs. What is Ursula von der Leyen's response? To insist on implementing the surrender deal that was a result of the extortion of the tariffs. It's crazy when you think about it, because the tool that Donald Trump used to extort the concessions that are in the surrender deal, and we can talk more about those concessions, has now been invalidated by the Supreme Court. Now, he's using an alternative now, but that can only last, I think, 3 months before the U.S. Congress.
150 days.
150 days, I think is, but yeah, so more, maybe like 5 months.
And it can be only a maximum of 15%. So she's not getting out anything of him.
Exactly. Now, and that has to be approved by Congress, which I think actually, as much as we have a supine Congress, remember that we also have a midterm election in November. And so I think it would be, my opinion is that the Congress is not going to pass those. They could prove me wrong, but that's my gut feeling. Anyway, the issue is that the European Parliament had not yet ratified her surrender deal. They were supposed to do it in January. It was scheduled on the agenda, but then Donald Trump started making his threats.
Greenland.
He was threatening tariffs, I think, of 25% on the specific countries that sent troops to Greenland. First of all, he can't do that. That he was threatening tariffs against, for instance, just against Germany. You have to do all of the EU or none of the EU. The EU, for the purposes of trade,
but I thought back then it was something like divide and conquer. He wanted to split the European Union with this thing.
To be honest, I was surprised they didn't try this earlier, because it's such a visible vulnerability that you can play European countries off against each other. So I was surprised, actually nobody knew when Liberation Day came and he walked out there with the chart. The first thing I noticed was that the European Union was on. Wasn't a given. There was a lot of speculation here in Brussels that he might walk out and have a chart that had individual European countries. And then it was a really open question whether the Europeans would reply to that in a unified way, say, you can't do that. We are one country in terms of trade. It's one tariff on all of us. I have my doubts of whether there would have been that type of unified response. So it was kind of like I don't want to give them any ideas, but it is kind of a very easy way to destroy Europe, which they chose not to do. But anyway, because those individual tariffs against the Greenland military countries blatantly violated the surrender deal, then of course the European Parliament suspended the ratification. Now, then after Trump had his reversal, for reasons we still don't understand, at Davos, then Ursula von der Leyen and her center-right EPP group said, okay, now we must immediately ratify the trade deal. Quick. We have to do it. And they were at the European Council, the one that was supposed to respond to Trump's Greenland threats on 22nd January, but ended up then being overprompted by that's not the word, made irrelevant by Trump's Davos announcement the day before. So they came out, they didn't really just decide on anything at that summit. They didn't even really discuss anything. But the one thing that they decided was to command the European Parliament to immediately ratify a trade deal. The Parliament, they got because of the center left, said, no, we're not going to do that. We need a little bit more time. But eventually, all the political groups had agreed to ratify 2 weeks ago. Even the center left, also the Greens maybe even signed up to this, and said, okay, we'll ratify in March. And then the Supreme Court ruling happened. And so Bernd Lange, the chair of the European Parliament's Trade Committee, he's from the center left, the Social Democrats in Germany, he said, okay, no, we need to suspend again because we don't know what's happening. And it looks like Trump's threats actually violate the deal. Ursula von der Leyen's EPP fought against that at that meeting. last Monday, because they said, bizarrely, we had EPP MEPs coming out of that saying the best way to have leverage over Donald Trump is to ratify this. Then he'll listen to our demands. I mean, it was absolutely crazy. That's EPP logic for you. That makes no sense. Of course, the leverage that it is very lucky for Europe. They dodged a bullet here that they did not ratify a trade deal before the Supreme Court ruling, and now they want to get rid of that leverage. I mean, the EPP has never met any surrender that they didn't want to grab by the horns. It's crazy that they're talking about still having this vote in March. I should make a quick caveat here that I'm calling this a ratification of the trade deal to simplify the issue. But in fact, this is just a ratification of part of the deal, but it's a very important part. It's the bringing the EU tariffs on US imports that did exist down to zero. The estimates for this are between 3 and 5%. Donald Trump says that they are 20%, which is a lie. So Donald Trump was saying that his tariffs are, quote, retaliatory tariffs against import duties that the EU has. The EU does have some import duties. They are not 20%. They're more like 3%. And that is what this vote in the European Parliament is for, to get rid of those. The other elements of the surrender deal, which is accepting the 15% baseline tariffs, which are illegal and violate WTO rules and therefore destroy the World Trade Organization, and also the $1.35 trillion in what I have called tributary payments by Europe to the US. It's a promise of investments in energy and other areas of the economy by European companies into the US. Now, the EU doesn't really have the ability to command its companies to invest in the US. Nevertheless, they are going to get close to that number. I mean, the US is really insisting that these investments happen. And when it comes to LNG, they're already happening. So it's a real thing, even though people like to poo-poo it as an empty gesture from the EU. It won't result in $1.35 trillion of investment, but it will result probably in $500 billion.
And we need these investments in Europe.
In Europe, right, exactly. It's sending money across the Atlantic to the United States between weapons purchases, LNG, liquefied natural gas purchases, and other corporate investments. It's really a crazy thing to do, but that's what von der Leyen agreed to. And of course, you have the implicit promises in the surrender deal, in the joint note that they put out afterwards in August, that the EU is adjusting its legislation to suit US demands. And you see von der Leyen is already implementing that with her omnibus proposals, which are dismantling EU digital laws, EU climate laws. She said, simply because she wants to improve European competitiveness. She's saying that Mario Draghi's competitiveness report asked for these things. It didn't. But Chancellor Merz is firmly backing these omnibus proposals. If you look at what's in these proposals, how interesting. It's exactly what the US wants. And it really gave away the game when the rapporteur for the file in the European Parliament, specifically for the digital omnibus to dismantle the EU's digital rules, it's a former lobbyist for Meta. That just tells you all you need to know. So, again, these last two things are more informal, the investment and the promises to change EU law. So that's not that the European Parliament doesn't have the ability to ratify that one way or the other. But on this specific point about the import duties, that's what they're about to give away. And, the EPP controls the European Union, so we very may well have this vote to ratify in 2 weeks. That's being pushed by the Speaker of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, who is from the EPP.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really worried with all the news I'm reading right now, because it looks like the Commission is trying to attack the Parliament and its rights to have any say over laws at all. It looks like the EPP, the conservatives and right-wing parties in Europe, are trying to make a dictatorship out of the European Union in a way, so that
It's
only
very
those
worrying. This
head of
trend to
states
bypass the
have
Parliament
a
is very
say.
worrying.
That only the head of states have a say via the Commission, and the people of the European Union, when they vote for the Parliament, what are they voting for? The Parliament has no say at all in anything. And my worry is that Trump has always attacked this cornerstone of European taxation, and that's the sale tax, which is very high in Europe, and in Germany it's like 19%. It's different in other European countries, of course, but that's not a thing that's not a tariff. And he's always talking
because it
about it
applies to
as if
European
it's a
companies
tariff.
also.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I worry that when this deal goes through, he will come for that at the next thing. And then he will demand that every American product is freed from the sale tax in Europe, which will give them an unequal better place in economy in
Exactly,
the
because the
economy.
European companies would be subject to the VAT, but not the American company.
Yes.
And so, all these EPP people pretending to care about Europe's competitiveness, I mean, it is, pardon my French, bullshit. Because when I talk to European business associations, they're being quiet right now because everyone right now is afraid to speak out against Trump. We see what happens to those who do, whether they be corporate leaders or whether they be national leaders like Pedro Sanchez. In Europe, if you speak out against Trump, you are ostracized. And that is applying to companies. So European companies are afraid to speak out on this. When you talk to them privately, they don't like what's happening with these omnibus proposals. They don't like the EU-US trade deal. They don't like the fact, for instance, that the CBAM, the carbon border levy, is probably about to be dismantled because of US pressure, because this is destroying European competitiveness. So everything that the EPP, Merz, and von der Leyen are doing right now in the name of competitiveness is only good for the competitiveness of American companies, because the things that were supposed to protect European companies and help European companies are actually being dismantled by these omnibus proposals. Roberto Alemano has written some great things about this, really looking at how these things hurt European companies. And I wish that European companies would say publicly what they're saying privately here in Brussels right now. It's really, it's one of the most frightening things of this era. What we've seen over the past year is how quickly dissent is stifled, how quickly we end up with this groupthink where everybody is afraid to say the truth because they don't want to step out of line. It is really something reminiscent the communist world, the fascist world, things we read about in history books that are now being played out in front of us. And it's, to me, that has been the most frightening thing the past year. And I would include European companies in that category who won't speak out about their private concerns about what's happening here.
I tried to ask Alberto to come in podcast as well, but it's hard to get hold of him on Twitter. What I don't understand is the conservatives in Europe. You write about this psychological dependency in nature. Does this explain how the conservatives in Europe are acting? Because, I mean, I've been watching them for half my life now in politics. And they are talking about protecting European workers and protecting European competitiveness, and everything they do will hurt us in the long run. Yeah. Just now in Germany, the CDU, CSU just destroyed practically every climate change rule we had. They are calling it freedom from the state, saying which heating you can have in your cellar. But the fact is, we are more dependent on gas and oil from America by then, and it will be more expensive. Yeah. And this is so stupid. And it will have bad consequences for everyone involved. It will have really bad consequences for the democracy in Germany if people have to pay even more. Affordability in Germany is a problem now, and it will become a bigger problem because of this laws they are doing right now under these conservative parties. And it's a problem in all of Europe. And I don't understand why. Why are they doing this for the well-being of rich American oligarchs and billionaires. Why?
I have my ideas on why they're doing it, and it's simply because they've fallen into a trap here because they haven't changed their thinking about America. I hear a lot from the left that, right now the EPP, the center right, is drifting way to the right. They're tacking way to the right. They're allied now with Giorgia Meloni's ECR, which by all accounts is a far right group. I mean, Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy is literally the successor party to Mussolini's fascists. That is a fact people don't like to talk about, but she's not, she's not the same as Le Pen. She's not governing in a far right way at the moment, but her party is a far right party, and that's where elections are.
Yeah,
But
Orban didn't start out as a dictator either.
Exactly. Orban was a member of the EPP. And so right now we have Manfred Weber, the leader of the EPP group, allying with Meloni. And
a Bavarian.
Bavarian. He's bringing these two groups together in a way that's really, at this point, kind of made them indistinguishable from one another. And I hear a lot of people on the left say, oh, this is the EPP showing their true colors. They were always fascists, and now the mask is off. I don't agree with that. The EPP has been dragged in a particular direction. I don't think that the center right has been center right before. They weren't fascists with masks on. What happened is the center right in Europe is also firmly Atlanticist. That varies by country. The center right, let's say in France, is obviously not as Atlanticist as the center right in Germany. There's still, I would say, the most center right in France, right? The center right in France is the most Atlanticist of all the parties in the country.
But they are
gone.
The
problem is, but now they're gone. Yeah, so to the extent that they don't exist anymore. But this is true for a lot of European countries, and also the UK. The problem is that now that the United States is turning fascist, right? We're now seeing the United States go in an authoritarian. I don't even want to use these weenie words anymore that people say, oh, it's moving in an authoritarian direction. I mean, it's there, guys. So that is where the US is. I don't think that's going to change. I'm not confident that we're going to have a free and fair election this year. Certainly not in 2026. So this is the new reality for the US. And so because these Atlanticists, these center-right Atlanticists, don't know any other way except to just blindly follow the United States, when the United States turns fascist, they turn fascist because they don't know what else to do. I wrote a Substack earlier this month called, I forget the exact title, but MAGA is making Europe take the blue pill, which is a reference to
MAGA
the
is
Matrix.
Blue pilling Europe.
Blue pilling, yeah.
Well,
so,
red pilling,
the Matrix,
I don't know.
Neo is faced with a choice, take the red pill or the blue pill. The blue pill convinces you that everything is normal, and the red pill opens your eyes to reality. The Europeans, that's certainly the center-right, EPP, is choosing to take the blue pill right now. They're letting the MAGA Americans blue pill them. They come over here, Scott Bessent tells the Europeans in Davos, calm down, this is totally normal, just ride the Trump train and you'll be fine. And what we're seeing is our center-right leaders are falling for that. They're saying, okay, let's go with the tearing up of the climate laws. The US is right. The climate laws went too far. Yes, the US is right. Immigration is a horrible thing that's happened to Europe. Yes, the MAGA's right. They're embracing the ideas because that's the easiest thing to do right now. And the hardest thing to do is go against the ideas of the country that controls Europe, that runs a military protectorate over Europe. I mean, the United States has been the boss of these people for 80 years. And when your boss suddenly turns into a fascist, you have two choices. You can defy the boss, or you can go along with the boss. And going along with the boss is the easiest choice to make. And these EPP people are not exactly profiles in courage, right? So they're doing the easiest thing. Could that change? I don't know. I mean, we did see at least Friedrich Merz send those troops to Greenland last month, although I will say he did so barely. I think there was like half a person sent to Greenland or something.
There were 13 Germans.
Okay, 13. Okay, to be fair. But then he really started walking it back almost immediately after he made the decision. He
saw his shadow and was afraid.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I wasn't super impressed with him during that whole thing, but at least he did it. At least they sent 13, you're right. troops over to Greenland. So, maybe they connect. But right now we are seeing the surrender is coming from the EPP, the center right, and the EPP is in charge. The EPP has controlled the presidency of the EU for 20 years. It has had the majority in the council for most of the past 20 years. It is still the largest party within the European Council. It's, to the extent that it matters, which it doesn't, it's controlled the European Parliament speakership for half the time and been the largest party in the European Parliament since, I believe, 2003. So the EPP is, in some ways, we've had like one party governance in the EU for the past 2 decades. And the thing is, because we don't have European political discussion, a European demos, nobody knows this. Nobody knows that they have been ruled by the EPP. Another Substack article I wrote, I think 2 years ago, actually, was why, it was after the European election in 2024. In what world did you have, in what national government did you have the governing party at the time of the financial crisis rewarded with 15 more years in power? Only in the EU world, right? So we had the center right was in power at the time of the financial crisis. They were largely responsible for it. What did the public do? They kept voting for the center right in the European Parliament elections, largely a national election, so that they kept control of the council, so that they kept appointing center right European Commission presidents.
But do you know why? Do you know why they are so powerful?
Is it a rhetorical question, or are you going to tell me?
That's a rhetorical question, because many of those EPP seats are coming from Germany.
Yes, that's
true.
And
in Germany, we do not have European Parliament elections in a normal way. Because I can remember when the European Parliament was elected and Angela Merkel was placated everywhere with the motto, Sie kennen mich, you know me. And it was a landslide for the conservatives in Germany for the European Parliament. And she wasn't even
on the ballot.
On the ballot. Yes. And that's why the Conservative Party in Germany is having so many people in the parliament, in the EPP, because of German conservative parties and their election wins, and of Angela Merkel. But this is declining. And the problem is, at the same time, we have the AfD, the right-wing party, who is pushing in those seats to win. And I'm really worried for the next European Parliament elections and the next council and how that will be stacked. Because those right-wing parties everywhere in Europe are gaining support. But at the same time, we see that in the polls, America is having a nosedive in perceptions by the people. And my question is, will those right-wing parties maybe have a more will those right-wing parties push back more than the EPP, for example?
That really worries me. I kind of got chills down my spine after the Greenland thing. That's the most vocal voice in France, certainly, maybe in all of Europe, defending European sovereignty in the face of the Greenland attack was Marine Le Pen. It's the national rep, Jordan Bardella. Everything she said was right. I listened to her and I listened to Bardella and I thought, I like this woman. That scared me.
Yeah.
If we're in a situation that I'm rooting for Marine Le Pen, not rooting for, but like I'm greatly enthused by her words, and Emmanuel Macron is completely silent, we are in trouble. We are really in trouble. Now, the thing is, that was easy for them to do. They're in opposition. So, of course, it's easy to snap at the sidelines. It is harder for all the reasons we know, because these are owned countries by the United States who rely on American military protection. It is difficult for a sitting elected leader to criticize the United States. It is easy for an opposition leader to do. So that's the dynamic we saw with the far right in Europe, because Alice Weidel also criticized the Greenland invasion or threat, the Greenland threat from the AFT. But we saw that across Europe, the far right parties in opposition criticized, but the far right parties in power did not. So Giorgia Meloni didn't criticize the threat to Europe's sovereignty. Viktor Orban didn't criticize the threat to Europe's sovereignty. Also, the PIS in Poland, who has the presidency in Poland, also really didn't criticize. So we can see that it's bullshit. We know it's bullshit because we know as soon as they got into power, they would do whatever Trump tells them to do, right? But it's easy for them to present themselves at this point as the parties standing up for national sovereignty against American threats. And that's a very dangerous position to be in. And our centrist leaders are ceding them the moral high ground by being silent when America extorts and threatens Europe, because they're allowing the opposition, whatever party they're in, to make the easy thing here, which is to criticize the American threats. So I absolutely share your concerns there that the more Trump threatens Europe and the more that our centrist leaders respond with surrender, we can see the way public polling is going in Europe. We are in a very dangerous situation here where the public is going to gravitate toward the far right for all the wrong reasons. I mean, these are people that are ideologically aligned with Donald Trump. They are going to get in bed with MAGA even more than our sitting centrist leaders. But you could forgive a voter for having the opposite impression at the moment. And we can also see it is against these centrist leaders' own political interests to be surrendering to the United States. We see Mette Frederiksen just called the Danish election a little bit earlier than she had to. And that's because she's riding high in the polls right now because of the Greenland stuff, because she stood up for Denmark and for Greenland. She was very visible during that crisis, criticizing the United States. She did not disarm after Davos. She was at the Munich Security Council and she said, no, the threat is still there. We are still worried about the US invading. And that was very brave of her, because our other leaders, Merz, von der Leyen, Macron, are pretending the crisis is over, right? They're pretending this is resolved.
It's not over.
Which it's not. I mean, we still don't even know why Trump backed down.
I mean, Trump right now is looking at Iran. But as soon as
as he gets distracted,
as soon as this pans out, and hopefully not in a world war, which is not off the table. But if this pans out and he needs a new shiny object, he's going back right to Greenland, because just now he said, I will be sending a ship to Greenland because they do not have efficient public health healthcare.
Which is crazy. It's exactly the opposite situation. But what's interesting is Mette Frederiksen, as of last year, she was predicted for sure that she would lose this election that had to be called this year. But now she's very likely going to gain seats, not a huge amount, but enough for her to stay in power. It's completely flipped. And why? Because she stood up to Trump. So all of our leaders in Europe should be, their instinct is to be cowards. Their instinct is to... Carney. Yeah, exactly. Also, Carney. So the problem is our leaders. It's their personalities that are the problem, not the political situation, right? Starmer, Merz. I mean, these are kind of just pathetic people. Yeah. And so they are doing what is kind of the easiest thing to do, because they have kind of ideological blinders, being Atlanticists, but also they're risk averse. Merz, not risk averse in what he says, but risk averse in what he does, I would say. And so that they're letting those worst instincts, von der Leyen as well, guide their decisions rather than what is evidently in their political interest. So I would hope that they see what's happening in Denmark right now and take a lesson.
I have to disappoint you. The moment when Merz and the Conservative Party in Germany learns any lesson will be the moment we are in deep, deep shit.
Yeah. The time
because
learn the
they
lesson,
are
it will
learning
be
the
too
lesson
late.
at the last moment.
I mean, that's the thing. We can't underestimate the damage that the past year has done. Even if all of these leaders suddenly change their tactic now, they surrendered to Donald Trump for a full year beforehand. That's not something people will
And the rules are
forget.
changed. They have changed law that took years to implement.
Particularly
And
with climate law. I mean,
yeah.
we're seeing the Green Deal took 5 years to put in place, and it's being dismantled in 12 months.
Yeah.
It's wild.
And they are destroying the democracy institutions in Europe as we speak, because they think they can rule top down in Europe, because then they can force through their beliefs about climate and economy. And in the end, those are not even their own ideas. They don't know what's going on in their own countries, in their own economies, and with their own people. They are
because
so brainwashed by American social media, they do not know what's going on.
What's crazy is these center-right EPP leaders were the ones. The Green Deal was their idea.
Yes.
They keep wanting to blame this on Franz Timmermans. It's not true. It was a central part of von der Leyen's platform when she came into the commission. This was Green Deal is her baby, even though the EPP wants to deny that now. And for the past 5 years, I heard EPP politicians routinely saying that these climate laws are good for Europe's competitiveness. We're going to be leading the green economy.
Which is
we don't want
true.
to cede leadership on this to China. And now all of a sudden, in the matter of an instant, they're sounding a completely different sound. There's no way that's not related to the fact that Donald Trump won the election in 2024. They like to say that, oh, we were saying this already in the campaign in 2024. Okay, but not to go this extreme, right? That they already had these ideas in 2024, and then Donald Trump's election made them double down. And what they're actually doing is exactly what they warned about themselves during the first term of von der Leyen, that if Europe doesn't do this, then China will take the lead. And we're already seeing that happen with wind turbines, with batteries. China is going to lead the green economy because that is where the economy needs to go anyway, just for economic reasons. This is just business sense to adopt these policies. And China's going to be leading them. And why? Because the center right in Europe allowed Donald Trump to tell them to do things that were against Europe's own interests.
I mean, the brilliance of Chinese political and economic doing right now is just lean back and let everyone else fail. I mean, that's brilliant.
They just need to wait it out.
Do anything and win. Because everyone else is stupid. I just see we need so much more time. But I try to end it in the next 10 minutes. So there's one question I have here. You propose 6 concrete steps through which Europe can reclaim its independence. Can you elaborate on these in detail, and why exactly these 6? On what empirical and theoretical basis is this list founded? And it's the last chapter in your book.
Yeah, what's interesting in terms of whether it's claiming independence or reclaiming independence, because reclaiming independence is an argument used by the far right nationalists. But what their argument has been is that it is the European Union that has taken away national sovereignty, and they want to reclaim the national sovereignty. My book says that you didn't have national sovereignty. That was an illusion, right? So it is an illusion to think that any country, any European country on its own can have sovereignty, because they are simply not big enough. If they are on their own, then the way Europe is set up, they are actually colonies of the United States. And that includes France, which is the least colonized, we can say, of European countries, because it does not have US troops within their borders. It has its own nuclear deterrent. France has been the best keeping its sovereignty in the face of American, European colonialism, if we want to call it that. Germany is among the worst.
Yeah.
There are American troops spread out all across Germany, occupying
Only West Germany.
effectively still. Only West Germany, true. Bases. The United States is still, even as we speak, using Germany as a base to launch their war against Iran. They did so as well with the Iraq War, even though Germany
which is
technically didn't
illegal, by
participate.
the way.
Yeah,
Illegal
there's a lot
in
to say about
international
that.
law and illegal in German constitutional law, but who would ask?
Exactly. Germany has culpability for what the Americans used those German bases for to launch, and Germany has been in denial about that for many decades. But so all of that is to say that this is. I don't like to use the word reclaiming sovereignty because it implies that these individual European countries had sovereignty in the first place, and you would have to go back pre-World War II to find a time that even some of these countries had sovereignty. So what we're really talking about here is creating a new sovereignty that hasn't existed before for Europe as a whole. So the argument here is you as individual European can only have sovereignty if it is claimed by the European Union as a whole. Your national government cannot give you that sovereignty. And if they are claiming that they can, they are lying to you, right? So the only way that Europe can have sovereignty in this world of great powers is to become a great power itself. And if these individual countries, none of them can be great powers on their own, and so therefore they cannot have real sovereignty. So the steps that I outline are to do with military powers. So I call for an EU army. That's a term that is often caricatured by the right as being one single European army. That's not what it means. It means basically the system like we have with the National Guard in the United States. A lot of Europeans don't realize that each state in the US has its own military. And those militaries cooperate under one federal structure. And they go to war. Those state militaries go fight in Iraq, in Afghanistan, under a national umbrella command. But they are under the command of state governors at the end of the day. And that's why we're seeing all these legal cases about Trump's use of the National Guard over the past year. This is widely misunderstood in Europe about what these things are. But so it would be something like that. It would be still national militaries in Europe, but coordinated under one European command and control structure, which we don't have right now. We have right now is an American, European, but more than NATO, right? So NATO is, what it really is a protectorate. It's not an alliance. Let's say NATO really was what Europeans pretend it is, which is an alliance. It still doesn't have the ability to take war and peace decisions, right? Each individual NATO member is obliged under the Article 5 to declare war on a country that attacks one of the members. But this isn't as cast iron as some people like to portray it, and it is still not a decision of war and peace. So you would need something stronger in terms of a European military defense. But if it makes people more comfortable, let's call it a European NATO. Because that is roughly what it would be. But not NATO as it actually exists, NATO as it should have existed, NATO as we like to think falsely that it is. So that's the military front. Then I also say that Europe needs to wield its economic power to use those levers that we talked about earlier to exercise its strength in the world. I also talk about how we need a fundamental change of education in Europe. That's both for children who learn nothing about EU civics. This shocked me. I actually started writing a book specifically about this back in 2017 when I was living in Berlin, or temporarily residing in Berlin, let's say, where I was looking at the education systems of Europe and how they teach EU civics, and found that they just don't. Eastern Europe does, because I think the reason is that they joined after the European Union existed in 1992. But the countries in which they were kind of graduated into the European Union, who had joined when it was just the European Community, so a much looser organization, were still teaching the EU as if it was the European Community to the extent that they teach it at all. And so that gives citizens absolutely no context of understanding EU issues, right? And that extends then on to lifelong learning, which is through the media. And I include the media in the education chapter because the media is a kind of educator. And the problem is European journalists went through the same flawed education system that the citizens did, that their readers did, where they learned nothing about the European Union. And so how can we even think we could create a European demos when we're not even educating citizens about what the European Union is and what it does. I use the analogy in the book. It would be as if a student in Texas was taught only what the Texas state government does, but completely ignored what the federal government does as if it doesn't exist. I mean, studies have shown that the split between state and federal law in the US is very similar to the proportion of EU and national law, member state law in the European Union. So to not teach people about the structures that make 60% of the laws that impact them on a daily basis is criminal negligence. I mean, it is absolutely crazy, but it's being done on purpose because it is in the national leaders' interests to keep their citizens ignorant about what the EU is. Why? Because then they can blame the EU for anything unpopular and take credit for anything the EU has done that is popular. Because if citizens don't even know the national governments have a vote on every EU law within the European Council, then the national governments can say, oh, this thing, I've seen this happen so many times that a national government says, hands are tied, the EU is making me do this when they voted for the thing in the European Council. I've seen that so many times. It happens constantly. So they do this on purpose. They keep their citizens ignorant because it suits them. And so Europeans need to demand that that changes because the national leaders are never going to do this on their own. And that brings me to the other recommendation, which is we have to dilute the power of the European Council. The rot, everything that's wrong with the European Council, not everything, but most things, come from the European Council, which most citizens don't even know what it is, even though it's the most powerful EU institution. It is the equivalent of the Bundesrat in Germany. This is the concept of the European Council is very easily
That's
explained
unfair.
to Germans.
The Bundesrat is really functioning.
Well, I mean that's what it is. So I would, of course, change the way the council works because I actually don't think the Bundesrat model works very well. What's interesting is the German constitution for the Federal Republic was designed charitably, I could say, with the Americans, uncharitably, I would say, by the Americans, but they basically made the Bundesrat what the US Senate was originally. Originally, state governments in the US appointed representatives to the Senate. And then eventually in the early 20th century, US states started changing it so that senators were directly elected by the people. But that's a relatively modern development. So the US.
But there's a difference to the Senate and the Bundesrat, because in the Bundesrat, the representatives represent the people and the number of the people. So you have more representatives if you have more people in your country. In Germany,
which is again,
not
I think,
the case in the Senate.
Exactly, and that's something very broken with the Senate, and I think people realize that it's one of those things
So the Bundesrat is a little bit more effective than the Senate.
Yeah, I would definitely say for sure the Bundesrat is what you would want to model more than the US Senate, which makes no sense as an institution anymore, particularly because each state is given 2 representatives. That was a system that was invented when states had roughly similar populations. And then later, when the US started making territories into states like Montana, South Dakota, these ridiculous states.
I'm sorry, I derailed you, but I had to defend the Bundesrat against the Senate.
No, I think I totally agree with you that the Bundesrat makes much more sense than the Senate. But anyway, that's what the European Council is. So the national governments send representatives to the council in the various formations, whether it be, finance ministers, prime ministers in the case of the council, the European Council, and it works just the same. The problem is that in the Germany, the Bundesrat is not the most powerful institution, right? It's the Bundestag that's the most powerful. That makes sense because it's the directly elected one. In the EU, the council is the most powerful institution by far. And those people in the council, yes, they have democratic legitimacy, but kind of barely, because they're not directly elected. They're indirectly elected because the people have elected the governments that send them. But if you look at the way people don't even really understand that those decisions are taken by representatives that they've elected, the ministers that they've elected in the home countries. And so that doesn't create much democratic accountability. So in the book, I recommend that we must dilute the power of the European Council. This is a big point that the former Dutch MEP Sophie in 't Veld raises a lot. She spoke at my book launch event in Brussels last month, and she raised exactly this point. She has a whole book about this called The Scent of Wild Animals. Give a little plug here, which talks about how you need to dilute the power of the European Council, and you need to make the European Parliament more powerful, including by giving it the power to initiate legislation. Now, someone from a national government would for sure tell me, well, of course she would say that she's a former MEP. And people in the perm reps here, which are the national representations to the council, they always like to talk about the European Parliament, and it's silly. Oh, we can never give these people more power. They're crazy. And they're not wrong. I would say about 2/3 of the European Parliament are crazy people, or lazy, not crazy people, but lazy or totally nobodies, right? The countries tend to send a lot of nobodies. But that 1/3 of the Parliament are really good, and they do work. And the Parliament actually does make legislation. I mean, it
If the
is a functioning
parliament were
legislative body.
more powerful, they wouldn't send
They would
crazy
send more
and
serious
and
people.
lazy people.
Exactly. But so the argument that the perm reps always make to me is the parliament just wants power for power's sake, and that's why they're always attacking the council. And look at some of these people, and they'll list some of the more notorious corrupt MEPs or stupid MEPs or lazy MEPs, and there's no shortage of examples of that. But I say, yeah, but if you made the parliament more powerful, then people would take it more seriously and send more serious people.
You know what? This remembers me of the starting point in the 19th century, when Europe and European countries started to fight for the democratization of their countries. And it started with the fight of the parliament against the authorities.
Yes.
And this is a fight right now of the European Parliament against the Commission in a way. And then we are back at the beginning, how not so old this old continent is, because we are fighting a war again about democratization of the institutions we have fought 200 years ago. And that's the interesting thing about Europe, because we are fighting constantly for democratization.
Yeah, and that's the thing
in the
about
history
the
of
EU.
our
It's
existence.
a project.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
It's a project in creation, and it can go any way, and it is nothing in and of itself. I thought one of the worst decisions that the EU ever made was accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, because that was ridiculous. There is nothing innately good or bad about the European Union. The European Union is a government. You wouldn't award the Nobel Peace Prize to a country, to a national government, because as soon as you award it, let's say you have a great wonderful charitable lefty government in country X, the country X gets the Nobel Peace Prize, not the people themselves, but the country. And then the next year, fascists take over that country, right? That can happen in the European Union, right? The European Union is not an innate force for good or evil. It depends on who is governing it, just like any country. And that's it could really go south very quickly if we have right parties winning a majority in the European Union. But also, it's important to point out that, right now the EU is a confederation. That is what experts call it. And that makes people very, use that word. But that's what it is. It objectively is. It's not a trade bloc. The word bloc drives me crazy. I never use it because it does not accurately describe what the EU is. People should use the word union, not bloc. But it could be downgraded into a bloc. That's what the British had wanted for years. I just wrote about earlier this week in my Substack about the problems of taking on Ukraine as a member. It would make the union, potentially, so unmanageable that it could never be more than a free trade bloc. That was why London and Washington pushed for Turkey's accession into the EU, because they either wanted the EU to be only a free trade bloc, or they didn't care if it became only a free trade bloc. And with Turkey as a member, it could only be a free trade bloc. And there's no way you could have an EU federation with Turkey as a member. We could spend an hour talking about why, but I would think for most people that's obvious. And Ukraine,
the Europeans are so racist, we didn't want.
Yes, thank you. Honestly, I think that's actually, it wasn't good sense. It was actually just European racism.
Yeah, we are so racist. We didn't want them.
But I think Ukraine isn't, because Ukraine presents a lot of the same issues that Turkey presented to a much lesser degree. The population is much less. You don't have the same cultural integration problems that you would have with Turkey. Ukraine is inarguably part of Europe, where Turkey, that's very debatable. But I think the problem is, if Mario Draghi says we need to become a federation, right? These leaders say they rate Mario Draghi. they like him and they think he has good ideas and we need to follow his competitiveness report like it's the Bible. But yet they don't want to follow the parts of the competitiveness report that they don't like, much like people treat the Bible, actually. So they want to ignore Draghi's call for federalism. Now we're talking about this two-speed Europe idea that Merz has floated, Macron has embraced, that maybe the best solution here is to have a core group of countries that move forward with federalization and you have an outer tier that don't. That's perhaps a good idea. I'm not necessarily against that, but it takes a lot of discussion and I am worried about it. Let's say I worry that actually makes the EU break apart. The fact is, though, that if we do want to not go in two-speed Europe direction and we want one union that everyone is the same speed, Ukraine cannot be a member. It doesn't work. I wrote about why in the Substack, and maybe it can work with this two-speed Europe idea, but then we really need to talk about that. And we need to talk about the trade-off involved in changing what the European Union is in order to accommodate Ukraine. And nobody wants to talk about that right now, right? Because everyone just wants to string Ukraine along and pretend that this is going to happen really fast. But the fact is, it is hugely complicated. This is not like taking in Montenegro or the Western Balkan countries whose European future is undoubtable. It's not even like taking in Moldova, which can join the EU either as a member state, or the easier route would be just reuniting with Romania, which is, in my opinion, a very logical thing to do. Ukraine is a very different situation. And all of that is just to say, we need to have these conversations. We need to talk about what a federal Europe entails, because if we don't, the European Union can easily be chipped away and downgraded into just a free trade bloc, which is what the far right wants. That is the stated goal. After Brexit, all of Europe's far right parties dropped the idea of leaving the euro or leaving the European Union from their platforms. That was the origin of the AfD, was an anti-euro party, and now they've turned into something very different. But none of them are advocating now leaving the European Union because they saw the effect it had on the UK, saw that it's unpopular with the public. But also they realized it would be much more effective to get into the EU and kind of destroy it from within. And we need to be very conscious of the fact that when we say destroy it from within, we don't mean that the EU would no longer exist. We mean that they would turn the EU into the African Union, into NAFTA, into something that is no longer a confederation, but is just a block of free trade.
Yeah. And that's not really working for the people.
Yeah, and that is not good for the people. And Europe will never be sovereign if the EU is only a free trade bloc.
Yeah, and the EPP is paving the way for the right-wing parties to make this happen because they are democratizing the European project when they want to consolidate power within the Commission. But the other point is this Europe of two speeds could work if you use the model of Bismarck's unification of Germany. But then again, you would need some outer forces to force the European Union to combine. So Bismarck had his wars.
Exactly.
To force
you need an external
unification.
enemy. In Italy, the same process had an external enemy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And
you could hold out for Ukraine. Ukraine could be like the Austrian Empire.
I mean, I think to accomplish any big project like this, you need an external enemy. I know it's ugly to say, but history teaches us that. And the thing is, Europeans are being handed external enemies on a silver platter now.
Right.
Most obviously with Putin, now also with Trump. And the thing is, the European leaders have been very eager and happy to lean into the Putin as unification through pointing Europe's unity against an external enemy, which is Putin. But, Russia, Ursula von der Leyen, when she talks about Europe's dependency, she only wants to talk about Russia. Europe is not dependent on Russia. It never has been. It was dependent in one area, which is energy, and that's it. Whereas with the US, its dependencies are multifaceted. They're huge. After the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall, these European countries were not any longer vassals of Russia. Russia did have vassal states in Europe, but that ended. And so if we're talking about modern Europe, there's only one country that Europeans are completely dependent on that treats these countries as vassal states, and that's the US. And so the galvanizing power of motivating Europeans to move against a country that has been occupying them and treating them as vassal states for the past 80 years is much more motivating than talking about Russia, a country which, I'm sorry, it's just these dependencies with energy, yes, but now we've lost that. We're no longer dependent on Russia for energy. A couple of border states are still slightly dependent, but that's going to go. We need to talk about the real dependency that von der Leyen doesn't want to talk about, and that's America. And mobilizing people to throw off those American shackles is probably the only thing that's going to make this European federation, which Draghi has said is necessary, happen. And so European leaders need to not be afraid to cast Donald Trump as this external enemy that should motivate internal unification, because that's how he behaves. That every citizen can see that he is behaving as an enemy of Europe. So why are we talking about it in any other way? It's just gaslighting.
Yeah, but it's not only Trump, it's America as a whole, which is a problem.
That's very true. That's a very important distinction, because so many Europeans want to act like Trump is an anomaly, and as soon as he's gone, everything will return to normal.
No.
Trump is a symptom of the problem, not the cause of the problem. And once he's gone, there will be someone else there, notably J.D. Vance, who is even more hostile to Europe.
Yeah.
So indeed, we need to talk about the enemy being America, not the enemy being Trump. I know that sounds ugly to a lot of Europeans, and a lot of people bristle when I say that. If we labor under the delusion that this is a one-man problem, we're going to get out of this dependency. We're not going to free Europe from this and make Europe solid.
No, it's a structural problem, because America now has so many structural problems inside its own society and politics that it, at one point, I don't believe the politicians in Europe, in the EPP, in Berlin, will do anything on their own. At the end, we have to hope for the implosion of America, of the United States. So they are forced to do something. And that's how they were forced to do something in the case of Russia as well. Because the Russian Confederation imploded. Yeah, the USSR imploded, and that forced them to do something.
Exactly. We always talk about how the West won the Cold War.
Yeah.
Did it though? I mean, the USSR just collapsed.
Yeah.
That's what did we do, actually? The USSR kind of collapsed under its own contradictions and its own weight. And that, I think also, this is another point, we talk a lot about US threats to Europe and authoritarianism in Europe. Authoritarianism in America. What Europeans don't like to talk about is, what if the US collapses? I mean, it is a very conceivable scenario here that the US is going to go to civil war. Look at some of these. You've got state militaries, the National Guard, ready to face off against the national military. What else do you call that?
Yeah, there are children which are not talking to their parents anymore because of politics.
I personally think
that's a point in the dysfunction in your society and politics, where everything could collapse if your children do not talk to you about politics anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends from the Balkans who say what they see happening in America right now is really reminding them of early 1990s Yugoslavia.
Oh, good. That's such a good sign.
Yeah.
As a European, I can tell you that's a good sign.
Yeah. The fun days ahead. I mean, I think that we need to be very cognizant of the fact that a civil war in the United States in the very near future is a distinct possibility. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen.
Some would say it's already going on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say if one does break out, you would wonder when people would put the start point, when they would say it actually started. And, I think when you say civil war about the United States, people are picturing the first one, right? State versus state. And that's not how this one would work. And that's not how civil wars in the modern world work now. Think about the Syrian civil war. That wasn't like region versus region. That was different militias, different forces,
Neighbor against neighbor.
different sects. Exactly.
That's the Balkans.
We're talking neighbor against neighbor, which is the Balkans. Exactly. So this is a very real possibility. And so then what happens? It was interesting when Trump, for this big military confab that Pete Hegseth organized in Washington, and Trump spoke to all the generals who are based in Europe. They pull out all of their generals from all over the world, including in Europe, their biggest staging post. They send them all to Washington, and Trump literally tells them, we may need your help here in US cities. So in other words, it's very clear what he's referring to there. If we go to civil war in the United States, which I think the regime is preparing for, because they want an excuse to instigate something in these cities when we have all these ICE protests, then we're talking about bringing the American troops that are here in Europe into the US to fight in that civil war. And so Mark Rutte's prescription here saying, dream on, Europeans, if you think you can defend yourself. And NATO is the only game in town. NATO is the only way to defend Europe. It's not just that you have to convince the US to keep their troops in Europe, because honestly, they're not going to pull out those troops. How would they wage war on Iran if they get rid of their bases in Germany? The US is never going to voluntarily pull out of Europe. We should be so lucky. But all of these threats that the Trump administration makes that they're going to pull out, no, they're not. They have no way to exercise global power if they pull their presence in Europe out. But if the US is preoccupied with an internal conflict or a conflict or a war with Iran, a war with China, whatever, then those troops leave. Yeah. And so then Europe is completely defenseless in the face of a Russian invasion. The only solution to this, the only way to prepare for this outcome, this likely outcome, is to have a sovereign, independent European military defense with European equipment. But Mark Rutte is the biggest block to that. And Mark Rutte, in my opinion, is the biggest block to independent European defense, because he is just entrenching the American protectorate further and further by making European countries buy more and more American weapons, by not developing European military production capacity, which you would do only through buy European clauses, which he and others are opposing, including
especially
Germany.
The EPP.
Yes. And so the Europeans really need to think about that scenario, because it's an entirely plausible scenario. And then the risk isn't America, invading, or America spreading its authoritarianism into Europe. Then the risk is this abandonment that they feared so much, Russia invading. Whether or not Russia has the capacity to do that in the next 5 years is, I think, debatable. I think Rutte is doing some scaremongering in that respect.
I mean, Russia can hardly overcome the Donbass. So
exactly.
I'm not worried.
And we need to remember there is a reason why Mark Rutte is, in my opinion, pretending that Russia has the capacity to invade the EU in the next 2 years, because Europe can't organize self-defense in 2 years, but it could in 5 years. Not a very strong one in 5 years. It really needs full 10 years, but enough to dissuade Russia, for sure. So why doesn't Rutte give a longer timeline? Because a longer timeline would mean we should start developing independent European defense. And that is his nightmare. His nightmare is Europeans being independent.
Yeah, his daddy wouldn't like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I see you have to come back. Maybe for the European Parliament elections the next time. Or maybe I will ask you sooner. Who knows what happens in the next years? Who knows what happens in November?
If there's a snap German election, I can come in.
Oh, that's not something we do here. Not usually.
We're in new times.
But I don't think Merz will have a funny year. 2026 will not be so much fun for the Conservative Party. And they will have a lot of hard questions to ask themselves. This right-wing pivot is not really liked in Germany.
Yeah.
Because it's center-right, but it's not center-right. So he will have a lot of pain this year. Okay. So do you have a message for my listeners?
I think there is a temptation right now when I criticize Europe's leaders on social media, I get a lot of replies being like, right on, they're betraying us, they're betraying the people. I think Europeans, particularly in certain bubbles maybe that I'm in on social media, Europeans may be overestimating the European public's disgust with Donald Trump and the US is doing. Yes, surveys are showing increased distrust of the United States, higher proportion of people not considering the US an ally. However, I could point to some other surveys which showed that a majority of Europeans think that things will go back to normal once Trump is gone. And that's the problem. And that's what we need to guard against. And I know that, my fans, my followers, whatever you want to call them, know that that's not the case. Sometimes I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. We all know this, but our neighbors and friends don't. And so we need to convince fellow Europeans who are not following politics that America is no longer their friend and can no longer be trusted. Because sure, here in Brussels, everybody knows that. In private conversations, not what they say publicly, but in private conversations, yes, everyone knows that. But, I partly live in Barcelona where my partner lives. And when you talk to people outside of politics who don't follow it every day, they're still talking about, oh, I can't wait to go on a vacation to America. It's my dream to move to America. Like, they're not getting this information. And that's partly a big problem with the European media, which I think largely sanitizes and sane washes what's happening in the United States. When I talk about this possibility of civil war in the United States, people smoke come down to Europeans' ears. I mean, their eyes go like, what? Like they just can't even comprehend that this country that they've been taught their whole lives is the shining example, the city on the hill, would go to a civil war. Like in their minds, Europeans cannot understand America as if it is any other country. It is like the country. It is the country that's too big to fail. So they can't even picture that scenario. And so I think all of us that are woke, who awoke to the danger of the United States and also understand the degree of control that the United States has over Europe, need to make our friends and neighbors understand, because they don't right now. The majority of Europeans are not awoke. I'm trying to not to use the word woke, which has not been co-opted. Awoke, let's say, awoken.
I like the word woke because my constitution is really woke.
But so I think the reality is that right now, Europeans don't understand, the majority of Europeans don't understand two things. One, the degree to which they are living in American protectorates and America controls their daily lives. And two, how much of a threat America is to them right now. And if we want to change what our leaders are doing, they need to feel the pressure from their citizens. And they're not right now. That's why they're surrendering, because their citizens aren't really paying attention. There aren't protests, Europeans outside the US embassies here, except in a few very specific cases in Denmark and Greenland with the Greenland threats. There aren't protests outside of prime minister's offices saying, don't surrender to America. We don't have protests here in Brussels outside the European Commission saying, don't ratify this surrender deal. Our politicians are not feeling the pressure from citizens because citizens are kind of checked out, in my opinion. And so we need to make people engage. It's not true that our leaders are betraying the wishes of a majority of their citizens. A majority of their citizens are not really aware of. And we need to make them aware if we want to change the political decisions of our leaders.
I can tell you, as East Germany is not such a fan of America. We have other problems. But then again, it's hard to comprehend for most Western Germans that in 1989, we were a hair's breadth away from a civil war in Eastern Germany. It was sheer dumb luck that this ended up unifying Germany without bloodshed. And that's the thing with German citizens. They usually do not know what could have happened. And that's the problem with European people as well, because sometimes we are just looking away until it's too late. So I don't think anything of substance will happen unless it's really, really painful.
Mm.
Because I did call my representatives in the European Parliament. I did call them, or at least the bureau, and I did tell them I did not like what is happening right now. And those people said to me, no, we are doing something. And I did write to my representatives in the Bundestag because of some things like Peter Thiel and those drones my government will buy with my taxpayer money. And there was only one representative who came back to me via mail. And that was the young Green Party representatives I know personally from Germany, from meeting at the CCC in Leipzig. Yeah, because maybe they remembered who I was.
Mm.
So it's hard to be engaged as a citizen, even if you are politically inclined, because those people do not come back to you if you have worries.
Well, and I think it's also true that they don't engage with these constituents' demands or requests unless they come in great numbers.
Yeah.
You may have been the only one contacting them on this topic. That's the problem. I mean, a lot of times when they don't get back to you, it means they didn't have a form letter to send. That's the case in the US as well. When you get a response, it's because you are among 1,000 people who sent the same request and they have a form letter to just insert your name and send to you. If you are one person contacting them about one thing, it's not even worth their time to write back to you because they don't have a form letter. That's what we need. We need a critical mass of people contacting their elected representatives and saying, stop surrendering to the United States. We don't want you to do this. And if you continue doing this, we will vote you out.
Let's hope so. Let's hope something happens before everything goes downhill, because then the battle to build something will be
becomes harder and harder.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for coming here. I hope you
great to be here.
I hope you find a great German publisher. I'm a big fan of the CH Beck Verlag. I don't know.
I see all the posted tabs there. Good to see. If anyone listening or watching is a German publisher, knows a German publisher, send them my way. Because actually, I've had very strong sales in Germany. In all of Europe, it's my number one market.
By the way,
more than the UK.
Just so everyone who's watching and listening, I didn't buy it via Amazon. I bought it in my bookseller here in my hometown. So.
An online seller or a bookstore?
I have a bookstore here, a little privately
Did they have it, or did you have to order it?
I had to order it, so it took a lot of time to get.
Yeah, that's
but
the
I
thing.
I didn't buy it via Amazon. I tried not to buy.
A lot of people are asking me this.
There's
lots of options to buy not on Amazon. On the website, you can see all the different. I think in Germany there's a website called Genia Local where you can buy it. But basically, every country I have some Amazon alternative. Unfortunately, the delivery time is a lot longer and it can end up being more expensive, which I don't know why. That's not the suggested retail price I sent to them, but it's also available in bookstores here in Brussels. I'm working on one in Berlin to get it in bookstore, but I'm working on it. But yeah, it is available not on Amazon. But unfortunately, which is symptomatic of the problem that the book describes, it's a whole lot easier to get it on Amazon.
Yeah, because I try to get rid of my dependence of American things. I took more time and I bought it for 2 more euros than it was at the Amazon platform. But I invested that because I did not want to give Bezos more of my money.
Yeah. I mean, the depressing reality is, because a lot of people have asked me about this Amazon thing because it seems contrary to the subject of the book. This is a self-published book. The book would not exist without Amazon. There is no European platform for self-publishing. My other platform to get it into the bookstores and the other websites is Ingram Spark, another American company. So there's actually no way to do this in a European way. And even Amazon is what makes this possible for self-publishers. There wouldn't be a book without Amazon, which is a very depressing reality. We need to build these alternatives in Europe. We need to do this.
Yeah, but that needs investment. And that needs state investment. And then we are back to a lot of problems Europe and Germany has with those things, because they are still brainwashed not to invest on a state-based manner.
Exactly.
But you have to come back. We will talk about those things maybe when you're coming back. And as I told you, please, whoever is listening and seeing this, German publisher, take on this book. And the title should be Der besessene Kontinent.
Yes, we already know the title. The title is
funny.
taken care of. We don't even need to expend any effort on that.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for your time.
Great to be here. It was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.